September the 28th in the year of 2021. Welcome everybody. I'm Dana, the Smurfed Up. Durnford, the nuclear proctologist.org. You can call in if you like. 709-589-4406. 709-589-4406. Just call for nuclear. If you got questions about nuclear, you can't get the answer, maybe I can provide it for you. And if it's about Fukushima, I probably can provide it for you. We're going to do a talk about Fukushima and radioactive food. Miles is in the house. Hi, Miles. I'm glad you're back. Okay, so Fukushima nuclear meltdowns. What are they? There was a tsunami in Japan, a country that hates animals and insects and birds and mammals. Well, not really, it's the nuclear industry, but they had multiple nuclear meltdowns. It might not seem like a big deal, but it actually is. And that the people that are put into slavery there are facing lethal doses. Let's say 10 sieverts is a lethal dose. So 1 million sieverts is a lethal dose from a very far away. So Unit 1, outside of it, was extraordinary numbers. The reactor cores of some of the reactors were ejected. This was reactor 2. This went China syndrome. Number 1 detonated, caught fire and burnt continuously for several days and released a large part of its fuel in fine particles, which is an invisible cloud that ended up covering the northern hemisphere. Same thing happened with reactor 2. The fuel pool caught fire. The reactor core also melted down into the earth and hit the water tables. It split the earth when it detonated, because you're talking 9,000 degree Fahrenheit temperatures hitting water. So this water expands 1,200 feet per liter in an instant. And so you can imagine 6 million pounds or so going down to the earth and hitting the water tables, detonated. The steam you see coming out of there, that's a lethal dose immediately. That's thousands of sieverts. And that also turns into a plume covering the northern hemisphere. Reactor 3 was where they reclaimed missiles. Well, this is how they make MOX full typically. I'm not sure if Japan was doing that, because they got their fuel from Sellafield, United Kingdom, where they reprocessed their fuel rods for sure, which have already gone through a chain reaction. This makes it 1 billion times worse than a typical nuclear meltdown and burns extremely hot. This was a 190-foot building. And what you're looking at, there's nothing intact inside of those rubbles. Reactor 4 was really unique, where we've seen the media pretend that the building is okay, and we've seen this portrayed worldwide. This was another nuclear meltdown. Multiple nuclear meltdowns. Never seen nothing like it. Each of these reactors, by the way, not counting the fuel pools where they had decades of reactor cores stored at the top of the buildings, the reactor cores themselves were considered 100 times Chernobyl. It's actually much worse than that, because Chernobyl was 200 tons, was mostly graphite with uranium. Japan's reactors never had graphite. They were pure uranium, pure plutonium, and they're 800 tons. At the top of the buildings, there was around 5 million pounds of used fuel. It put it in a pool because it's still splitting the atom. It's still producing the energy to power 1 million homes. Except those atoms, instead of heating water, they're released into the water. The water is saturated with fission trillions per liter of isotopes. That then is released up to stacks each day in amounts of about 120,000 liters times trillions of isotopes per liter. This a single atom out of those trillion can end up giving you up to 1,800 illnesses and diseases and autoimmune deficiencies and injuries and illnesses. But it might be latent. It might take time for that to manifest and be diagnosed. Nothing like this has ever been attempted. Yale professor, all of humanity will threaten for thousands of years if a single rod touches in Unit 4 fuel pool. So imagine a single building threatens humanity. You can't threaten humanity without threatening the millions of species that a lot of them are now gone because of these meltdowns. Now the fuel pools were at the top of reactor 4. So the Yale professor was hoodwinking you. The Yale professor, there's no way he didn't know that the fuel pools weren't there. Same as there's no way the media mistake that the fuel pools weren't there and came out and lied to you and pretended. Here's one of them right here. Listen to him.
We are here inside Reactor 4 at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant that was severely crippled during the earthquake and tsunami of 2011, leading to the country's worst nuclear disaster.
And so the fuel pools would have been at the very top of the buildings, up here. So for her to look down, she had to be way above that, 190 feet almost in the air to look down. Now, if you go over there, there's nothing there that won't kill you. That's a lethal dose, no matter where you toast. So she's probably not even in Japan, just in a similar. America has multiple buildings like that. That's kind of a. That's a bit better. So why is the mainstream media, not just the reporters, but the producers, the editors, the owners, pretending they're at the top of a building that don't exist? That should terrify you. I'll explain why. So they've done the same thing with Reactor 3, where they pretended that they were at a building that actually physically is completely destroyed. And the fuel pools would have been at the very top of the building. That's the Reactor 3 you're looking at over there. It was. Reactor 4 is gone. And that's what Reactor 3 actually looked like after they used the homeless and destitute to tear the tops off the building. Then they came out and pretended it looked like this. So the buildings were completely destroyed. And the mainstream media came out and pretended that everything was functional when it's not. Now, the reason they done that is because of this phenomenon of the releases. We call it in our cultures a radioactive fallout. I'm currently down there in Newfoundland, on the most easterly point of North America, or Canada anyway. And the radioactive fallout, you can see this model is only on the venting, it's not on the actual inventory. So the model would be much more severe. And the model stops after a short period. April the 4th is when the model stops, or April the 7th. So the model is not very accurate. And so here's another model. This is the Pacific Ocean. On the other side of me is the Atlantic Ocean. Where my fingers to is where I'm currently at. So we have this radioactive fallout that covered the planet. And that covers the planet. Oh my God. And I see we're being spammed in the comments in the poll that I have up for everybody. That's pretty bizarre. I'll show you the poll that we got up here. Bear with me. So we got 43 votes, but we only got 20 people on our show. And we still got 70% saying yes and 30% saying no. So it's a pretty strange poll because you only got 20 people on it. But we have a significant amount saying yes. Surprisingly, we have 29% saying no. That's the most bizarre thing imaginable that you looked at that time. Okay, so the radioactive fallout is not just bad in Japan, it's bad here in Canada and the entire northern hemisphere. So last week, the EU is going to ease restrictions. That's a lie. They're going to remove the restrictions on all food import from not just Fukushima, but all of the prefectures, the food was banned. Have a look at that. So it wasn't just one prefecture. It was over half of Japan, the food was actually banned. Now, Iceland and Norway are also going to remove the restrictions from all those prefectures. So when you talk about radioactive food in Japan, you're not just worried about Fukushima prefecture, you're actually worried about 14 prefectures. FDA lifts, now it was Joe Biden who lifted it, and he told the FDA to do it, and that was after a meeting with a appointed prime minister in Japan, not elected. Prime Minister Suga is not elected, he's appointed. And so 2 years ago, the Fukushima government has opened a sake shop in New York. The government of a nuclear wasteland opened a sake shop of brews specializing in brews from the nuclear wasteland. Try wrapping your mind around that. Excuse me. Well, you'll like this. Now we got 53 votes, 70% yes, 30% no, and we still only got 20 people on the show. But 53 people voted, but we only got 20. That's crazy, isn't it? That's crazy stuff. Let's keep going here. Now, the IAEA in 2011, June, admitted there was no such thing as a safe level of radiation. No such thing. And the IAEA is a corporation that was created in 1957 by an anonymous group. Nobody knows who created them. But in 1959, they started reporting to another corporation known as UN. It's a global takeover. George Bush Sr. referred to him as the New World Order. In fact, let me just play that clip for you. Let me just play that clip for you today. I better check the volume because these things can...
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
So he just called United Nations the New World Order. New World Order. And that's who controls the IAEA, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, UNSCLEAR, ERPA, nuclear lapdogs. U.S. lifts post-Fukushima import restrictions on Japanese products from all 14 prefectures with no checking why it's still melting down. So when you look at this radioactive fallout covering the entire northern hemisphere, that's global warming. That's pulsing energy every second at the speed of light. This is why it boils, it's able to power 1 million homes. When you release it into the environment, it's still pulsing energy. So when you take it out of the reactor after 16 or 18 months, it's now still producing those isotopes, but now they're released into the environment. You got 440 reactor cores or fuel pools worldwide releasing radiation to the environment. Now this model is from nuclear meltdowns, but 440 nuclear pools still splitting the atom 24/7 is going to have those same attributes. Okay, so FDA lifts it, and they lift it in multiple prefectures. Multiple prefectures were banned. All those prefectures, the entire, and Tokyo should be banned too because we've done entire presentations on Tokyo. A Canadian newspaper tried to get the soil tested for radioactive fallout. Private companies, government agencies, and universities all refused to get involved. Imagine that. They're also growing food right in the nuclear wasteland ground zero. They're harvesting it and growing it right alongside of millions of one-ton bags of radiation. They actually never stopped growing it. You're talking about 850 million pounds a year being shipped worldwide being shipped to other prefectures, relabeled, and then shipped to other countries. Many countries have caught them doing it, by the way. If you eat that food grown alongside of that, you're going to get sick and die soon after because these are heavy doses. And so leukemia is a blood disorder. If you eat radioactive food, it sequesters in your muscles, your organs, and your bones right away. Your body attacks it with white blood cells. That displaces your red blood cells carrying oxygen, nutrition throughout your body. And what happens is now your body's saturated with white blood cells. You no longer have red blood cells. You're suffocating, you're asphyxiating, you're hypoxia. And that's known also as leukemia. And that can happen in just a couple of days, particularly from eating the food. And that's permanent. You will die from that. EU to lift import curbs on rice from Fukushima. Now they've released all restrictions on all prefectures. No checking for anything. And America had done it. Actually, they're going to do it on the 10th in the EU of October. The United States of America had done it last Tuesday. So now they're going to try to send as much radioactive food to poison you so their own friends and families don't get poisoned. A farmland development project testing the reusability of soil generated from radiation decontamination work. They're taking nuclear waste and cutting it open, dumping it in the ground in the actual exclusion zone, abandoned community, radioactive communities, and growing food and the intentions of selling it. So there's a real sickness in this industry. They absolutely unequivocally hate us. They despise us. They, for some reason, are trying to slaughter us. Carried out by the Environment Ministry in a restricted, difficult to return zone, the nuclear wasteland itself, right alongside of multiple ongoing nuclear meltdowns. Now the radioactive fallout, this is another model of that radioactive fallout, covering the northern hemisphere. This is the Pacific Ocean. I'm going to speed it up for you. And now all of Canada, all the United States, the entire Pacific Ocean in just a couple of days, in 1 week, is covered in radiation. A sustained, continuous plume. It's not like a little plume come out and it's, you know how a car backfires or a transport truck backfires and this black puff of smoke comes out and drifts along. This is covering the entire continent in an invisible snowstorm of thousands of fission products. It's the worst case scenario. It's truly the worst case scenario. It's been going straight into the ocean, but it didn't need to. It covered the ocean, and so the ocean radiation, uranium, plutonium, curium, americium, neptunium, all these isotopes have saturated the ocean or suspended in it like sediment in a mud puddle. Except it's invisible. You can't see it or smell it or taste it or hear it or feel it or touch it or pick it up or throw rocks at it. But they're trying to distract you, saying they're going to dump the tanks in the ocean, and therefore now the ocean might become polluted. But the ocean has already been polluted brutally. It's been continuously hemorrhaging into the ocean. This is NOAA's model. They're only using 137 of cesium. It doesn't use all these other major fission products in that model. So they say they got 1,000 tanks. We actually counted the tanks. There's 750, and 150 of them are really small ones. Now, they won't let anybody test the tanks independently. The Japanese government has been accused of a cover-up. It refused to allow independent testing of water from the power plant. Now, the reason they've done that is because the tanks are empty. Because you're talking about radiation at such a high dose that if you filled up a single tank, you can't get back on the site. You're talking about 1.4 million sieverts. So you couldn't build another tank for starters, and you can't get back on the site. Now, if you did happen to fill up all of these tanks, you had an earthquake, what would happen? A lot of these tanks would hemorrhage. Now you can't get back on the site. There's nothing in the tanks, because otherwise you couldn't be on the site and you couldn't build another tank there. Just like, don't worry about Fukushima. Instead, you're supposed to worry about all 14 prefectures for the next million years because it's still melting down. So they're trying to convince you that without nuclear, carbon, carbon, they claim nuclear is somehow carbon free. Does nuclear look carbon free to anybody? That's global warming, pulsing energy every second now for the next million years. That's how nuclear actually works. So there's a poll there. You can vote whether you think nuclear is carbon free. We got 58 votes and 24 people on the show and 15 thumbs up. But 58 votes on the poll. So the polls are doing good. And we're 71 up and 29 down. So that's bizarre. So there's actually over 12 people voted down. There's something hooky going on there. We're ready then. So the tanks. So in 2013, there was 1,000 tanks. In 2014, there was 1,200 tanks. 1,200 tanks. In 2017, there was 900 tanks. In 2019, there was 1,000 tanks. The line my fingers on over there. In 2021, or currently in June of this year, April, was 1,000 tanks. So you got 1,000 tanks in 2021, and 1,000 tanks in 2013. But the problem is when you count the tanks, you actually only got 750. So if they were filling up tanks all the time, then they got a bottomless pit tank, right? It's extraordinary because that's part of the cover-up, see? By the way, the bolts in the Fukushima, they bolted these tanks together. If you fill it up with lethal doses by the gallon, then you can't even walk over a hose without it killing you. Not only that, this is going on at the site. You have radioactive fallout constantly. Your community is abandoned 30 kilometers away. So you can imagine how bad it is at ground zero. The reactors are still melting down and releasing these isotopes. And there's a unique thing about radiation in large quantities. And so the plumes I showed you hitting North America have the same effect as what I'm going to talk about for a moment here, is this effect known as the Bromson lung. 2 sieverts, by the way, 2 sieverts an hour are better radiation. So they're not counting gamma, alpha, neutrons. Okay. So the radiation pulsing at the speed of light in every direction, right? Each pulse goes in all directions like a detonation. And they hit each other at the speed of light almost, and they change direction. It's known as braking, Bromson lung effect. And what happens is it creates another effect besides the effect of the actual radiation. It creates like an X-ray effect also. So double killer. It sterilizes all the insects and flora and fauna on the planet. And so lethal doses by the gallon. Do you really think the tanks are going to be filled up? So you would need tanks that are, say, 2.5 feet thick of pure steel to shield you from that effect. But the tank would also have to be airtight. But also, when you're putting that kind of numbers in a tank, you're talking about fuel particles from fuel pellets. That will sink to the bottom and create a chain reaction, and you have another China syndrome. The tanks will empty into the ground. You have to abandon the site, see? So, but think about this headline here. Resulting destruction will take half of the planet with it. So what they were alluding to was the radioactive fallout that I had showed you earlier. Okay. There was also 15 reactors that couldn't go into shutdown. So who knows how many actual meltdowns they had there. So the radioactive fallout covers, that's the Atlantic Ocean, covered in radioactive fallout. And what we're seeing is all the birds, mammals, and animals are emaciated. I've done multiple research expeditions over the last decade. 6 years of going, almost straight going to Alaska. And all the species were wiped out on the coastline. All the species are wiped out on the coastline. Let me show you what I mean by that. They never came back. So you had the plume cover in the northern hemisphere. This is the Atlantic. That's the Pacific over there. And so the birds are going to be eating marine life that is bioaccumulated to migratory birds, right? So I launched expeditions all the way up to Alaska from British Columbia, Canada, Vancouver, around Vancouver Island multiple times, meandering for 4 to 5 months a year on the ocean. We're leaving Port Hardy. That's the top of Vancouver Island. So we're going for no man's land now. We'll the top of Vancouver Island. To the kickoff about 30 miles away, 35 miles away, anchor off tonight with a beach line. And in the next couple of days we should make it to Shearwater. And we'll upload this little video. And then, so it was all over the coastline, right? Doing research expeditions. And what we discovered was just incredibly shocking, unbelievable shocking. When we finally got up there and done the research, you can fill the beach up with people, but you're not going to find the species to your left. They're actually now exterminated. These are before and after. And this was symmetrical for the entire coastline. To your left, you're seeing a extinction event. The species to the left, you can never take those pictures again, including Alaska, because we went all the way to Alaska. They're exterminated. That's radioactive fallout. So, do you think that nuclear power is carbon-free? Does anybody think nuclear power is carbon-free? If you can vote yes, it's carbon-free, or no, it's not carbon-free. So 67% thinks it's carbon-free. Look at that. Of 61 votes with 25 people on my show. And 33 people rightfully thinks it's not carbon-free. So something that wipes out all the species, according to the poll, thinks it's carbon-free. Does that make any sense? So the species to your left are now exterminated because of Japan's nuclear meltdown. So does that make it carbon-free because no carbon life exists? Is that why everybody's voting yes, it's carbon-free in the polls? So I'm being spammed in the polls. A pretty incredible desperation, right? How desperate are you that you would create all these accounts and vote 67% says nuclear power is carbon-free? Obviously, it's not carbon-free, right? That is incredible. So the species now are exterminated because of carbon-free nuclear. So nuclear has made the planet carbon-free by killing all the carbon on it, is basically what we're seeing. So the radioactive fallout done that. The radioactive fallout coats the entire planet with an invisible snowstorm of radioactive fallout, and all the species to your left disappear, like to the right. These are before and after pictures of the same place, multiple research expeditions. And we were warned that these nuclear power plants threaten an extinction event around the entire planet. And lo and behold, to your left, you can see there is no more paradise. It's been wiped out. So when the birds are migrating along the coastline, can't find their normal food, they would just normally go into the tidal zones and feast on all the species, see? Because there was all these species for the birds to eat. Now when the birds can't find their migratory fish to go to the coastline, there's nothing left to the right, only the algae. And instead of 700 algae, there was only 3. There was common kelp, kelp cabbage, and kelp weed is basically the 3 kelps that are remaining, right? There's some technical difficulties here, are we? We'll get there. Okay, so something that wipes out all the species, is that carbon-free?
May be worse than thought. Studies from last year indicate that radioactive water will contaminate the entire Pacific Ocean in just 6 years. Kim Min-ji reports.
This graphic shows the gradual contamination of the Pacific Ocean due to leaks of radioactive water from the crippled Fukushima nuclear plant in Japan. The simulation, which was run by a German marine research institute, shows the entire Pacific waters being polluted by radioactive water in just 6 years.
Okay, but it was actually covered in just a couple of days, including the Atlantic. It didn't take 6 years, see? And the ocean currents will do it in 45 days. Right, the Kuroshio current actually circulates. The ocean current is actually real, and it takes about 45 days at 5 miles per hour, 24 hours a day, times 45 days, means it crosses the Pacific Ocean. Now, irrelevant to that, the ocean also evaporates tens of thousands of square miles of rain clouds. That comes into the coastline, hits the mountains, and loses a lot of their payloads, and then it rises up and goes over the mountains to the rest of the continent. And that big payload ends up trying to wash down to the coastline. But what it means, though, was that that big payload is constantly coming in and hitting the glaciers. So instead of being turning into snow and eventually compacting into glaciers, a process, of course, takes thousands of years, but that's the cycle, right? Now it's bringing in radiation constantly. It's also still hemorrhaging out and flowing over and doing the same thing, but it's this constant cycle of rain clouds full of radiation being picked up from a radiated ocean and hitting your glaciers. So the glaciers can't crystallize because you have all this energy pulsing every second there. And so it disappeared. Now they only have snowpack in the winter times. They don't have glaciers anymore in the summer times. And everybody seems to be unwilling to acknowledge that has happened. But if you go look at it, in the summertime there is no glaciers. Now that cold water would regulate the streams, the estuaries, the lakes, the rivers, and including the coastlines. That cold water comes down all the way to the coastline, raises the level of the rivers during droughts and allow migratory marine life to come up the rivers, because the hotter the summer, the more the melt. The river is still high enough for migratory species to get up there. Without that, you don't regulate the temperatures, then there is a complete failure of tadpoles and trout and fish, and the whole ecosystem now flounders. After a couple of cycles of that, you basically exterminated the genetic superior selection. The nuclear industry was out there pumping the tsunami map, originally telling you it was Fukushima. That's Noah's model, but here's Noah's model of the actual ocean. They hid that away. Fukushima has humanity on the brink of a possible worldwide nuclear holocaust, and it did, right? We're doing research on the East Coast. There's no spiders in the woods. Wrap your mind around it. No spiders in the woods. I got a bad cough here. Hang on. I'm exhausted. There's a comparison.
The fact that the reactor in Japan is 100 times more powerful than the one in Chernobyl, and
the reactor in Japan is 100 times more powerful than the one in Chernobyl. And the reactor in Japan, to the right, is the reactor 4. It's gone, right? So, there's this incredible, bizarre death cult known as nuclear. It's a coward's society on top of that. It's a coward society. Now, when you look at nuclear power plants worldwide, my apologies. When you look at nuclear power plants worldwide, hang on. do this again here. There's a phenomenon that we discovered. So I went looking for pictures of nuclear power plants. This is, by the way, the future nuclear power plant for United Kingdom. This is the design. They have a 3D version of it. And so what's unusual about that is it's surrounded, as far as you can see, by farms. These plants are always hemorrhaging radiation from the fuel pools for starters, and when they store it in casks, the casks are all vented. So you have farms built right up to the nuclear power plant. Now, 11 becquerels a kilogram, children start to see hole in their hearts. At 50 becquerels a kilogram, it's irreversible. And 50 becquerels a kilogram of radiation in your food for adults is permanent lesions to your organs. So when I started looking at pictures of nuclear power plants, this is what I found. Every single picture for the first while was surrounded by farms, and then a scattered one with communities and farms. So why did they build all their nuclear power plants in farmland? They built it because the radiation ends up in the food and then they ship it to everybody worldwide. This is how insane the actual nuclear industry is. This is the definition of insane. That somebody even done that a single time, let alone with every single nuclear power plant that I can find is surrounded by farms. Now, you say, well, Dana, how do you know for sure that the radiation is going to end up in the food? Well, we have endless studies. You have grapevines sucking up radiation, strawberries sucking up radiation, wheat sucking up radiation, tomato plants sucking up radiation, fruit plants sucking up the radiation, the accumulation of radiation by plants. You have transfers of radiation on the tree root system. To how the meadows where the cows are sucking up radiation. So then, if I can find that, surely the nuclear industry must have known that. I can't be just a one-off. So what you're looking at is they're murdering you. A nuclear power plant is meant to murder you every way possible. Every way you look at it, it's designed to murder you and all the other species. But particularly you, look at the farms. What do you think they got it in a farmland? So they can poison you. Do you think that I'm making this up? Do you think I photoshopped all these pictures? Do you think this is just a one-off? It's just the first 100 he found. The rest of them probably don't got farms. Well, when you find all these pictures in a row, one after another, after another, after another, after another, after another, power plant, nuclear power plant, after nuclear power plant, after nuclear power plant, after nuclear power plant, in farmland, endlessly it seems like, almost every plant is in farmland, and that it's always hemorrhaging radiation. The radiation is going to end up in the food. Then you would have to assume that they're not stupid, they're not naive, they're not gullible. They know that putting a nuclear power plant in farmland is the definition of evil, right? And look at, this is a future nuclear power plant. Here's the original draft, and here's what it's going to look like. A brand new power plant, United Kingdom, surrounded by farmlands. Now, does anybody out there actually believe that's carbon free? Because that's a poll that I put up 46 minutes ago, and 65% of people says it's carbon free. But I only got 23 people on my show, 22 people on my show, despite the fact that this is a new channel with 393 subscribers. I can't get more than 20 odd people on my show. But I can get 64 people, or a large percentage of pro-nuclear, claiming nuclear is carbon free. Obviously, that's the industry, and that they're desperate to influence you. That's desperation. That's an idiot. Whoever got all these ghost accounts and is saying that nuclear is carbon free is the definition of a lunatic. They're pathetic. Can you imagine how pathetic they actually are? Can you imagine how twisted you got to be to hang out and do something like that? By the way, all nuclear power plants, all of them, need at least 2 external power supplies. So a typical nuclear power plant has 2 external power plants minimum that are gas, oil, or coal. But coal was the cheapest. So most of the nuclear power plants' external power supply, because they can't run on their own power, is powered by coal. So does anybody think that these coal plants powering a dirty nuclear power plant is carbon free? That should terrify you. So you can't call nuclear carbon free. It has 2 external power plants dedicated to keeping it running. And if you really want to look at the construction of a nuclear power plant, here's the construction of a nuclear power plant. Does that look carbon free to you? You got any idea there's not a piece of precious metal left in the United Kingdom that they didn't gobble up and using that, and all of that becomes highly radioactive when they finally try to decommission the place, which takes about 100 years to decommission it. It takes 100 years to decommission a nuclear site. So is that carbon free? And then if you look at the cycle of nuclear, yeah. Okay. So let's look at the cycle of nuclear quickly, because we're talking about carbon-free nuclear. Well, first off, there's 15,000 abandoned uranium mines in just the Navajo countries. So when they mine this carbon-free, the very beginning of it, they're trying to bring it out of the ground. This is equipment from a uranium mine. Does that look carbon-free? Then the mines, like this is just barely enough to power a power plant for 18 months. Is that carbon-free? That pond you're seeing there is chemicals to separate the yellow cake from the other stuff. And then that's evaporated and leaches into the water tables, is evaporated into the environment. Is that carbon free? The whole nuclear process is the most carbon intensive thing you can imagine. And then everything's got heavy security, which is major carbon intensive. A lot of it for 75 years has been just dumped into the ground without telling anybody where it was dumped. Okay, so putting all that in the ground, that's going to rot in just a couple of years. And the radiation ends up in your ground, ends up in your water tables forever and ever and ever. Is that carbon free? You can't go back to your graveyards in Japan, for instance. Is that carbon free? 30 million one-ton bags. There's actually 60 million we got now, a new number. Is that carbon free of radiation? Look at it. And they're cutting that open and growing food on it. Like the whole legacy of the nuclear industry, you can't get close to the ship without your Geiger counter screaming, is that carbon free? Going out and dumping it all over the ocean, which is all the dead zones on the ocean, right? Yeah. Yeah, so okay, they dump it in the ocean, all these dead zones, thousands of dead zones. They just drive around the ocean constantly just throwing it off. Then they come out, the bizarre creatures. Two of these are terrorists. One's a shoe bomber, the other one's a nuclear scientist on YouTube. He's going around telling everybody that radioactive fallout is like walking in sunshine. That is like the rocks, or is like bananas, or is like potato chips. That's what the guy to the left has been doing for years and years and years on YouTube. And of course, he gets promoted. So when you look at the history of nuclear, all those dots you're seeing is nuclear missiles they put in your communities. That's missiles in nuclear communities. They're using your communities as human shields. Now, the stuff they're dumping in the ground, of course, now you can't drink the water in any of those communities. Is that carbon free? When you look at all of the releases from these reactors, how can you call it carbon free? 3 million children. 3 million children. That's permanent treatment. Is that carbon free? You can't go back to your shops, your communities, your hospitals, your schools, your universities, your malls, to visit your family's property because it's nuclear wasteland. Is that carbon free? Dropping that on them, is that carbon free? Just dropping it in the ocean. Is that carbon free? Is this carbon free? If that was your shop, would you call that carbon free? Do you get what's really going on here? Is that plume covering the northern hemisphere, is that killing all the species? Is that the definition of carbon free? These are questions we better start asking ourselves, because I can assure you it's not carbon free. It's an invisible cloud of death wiping out all the species. An invisible cloud of misery that's caused. It's a cloud of diseases. Because they got you tricked over decades in increments thinking that the only thing that's going to happen is going to be cancers. But there's heart problems and liver problems and lung problems and respiratory and pituitary and thyroid and adrenaline. There's Alzheimer's and dementia and autism. France says Japan's lost control and that the French should leave the country. Not Fukushima. Not Fukushima, but leave the country. And as you can see, they were right to leave the country, because the whole country is actually radioactive. They just won't buy the food from half of it. But the numbers are incredible all the way up to South Korea, for goodness sakes. The Swiss embassy evacuates Tokyo, far, far away. See? Officials unsure what to do next. Korea calls Japan's handling of Fukushima incompetent. But it wasn't Japan, it's the nuclear industry. Has captured your regulators in increments over decades, captured your universities, captured your medias, and I mean totally captured it, and captured, of course, key positions in government so they can get their funding to, and misery. They're exterminating us. The pictures of all those nuclear power plants with the farms, that's not maybe. That's fact. That's murder. That's murder to do something like that. You won't see oil, gas, coal plants in farmland. And you definitely shouldn't see nuclear in farmland. It's unbelievable betrayal. The industry is actually insane. The nuclear industry is a coward industry. And they're actually morons. The one thing you find out quickly when you start analyzing the nuclear people in the nuclear industry is these are morons. These are cowards. They're robots. They're doing what their father and mother done, and their father and mother had done, and their parents had done. They're just pure murderers. EU Energy Commissioner called Fukushima an apocalypse. Tokyo's lost almost all control of events. Tokyo didn't have any control because the nuclear industry took over right away. Top Hong Kong Chinese newspaper, Fukushima is a global threat. A global threat. And it's a global threat because of the radioactive fallout, and they're growing food in the nuclear wasteland and shipping it worldwide on top of that. The slower it spreads radiation, the more effectively it produces cancer and 1,800 known diseases. Japan is going the very best way in the world for destroying the human race. Former official in Fukushima, this is a disaster of all of humanity, the entire world. All of humanity, the entire world. Nuclear report warns of apocalyptic scenario at Fukushima in weeks ahead. This could one day be considered the start of the ultimate catastrophe of the world and the planet. This could one day be considered the start of the ultimate catastrophe of the world and the planet. What do you think he's talking about? He's talking about what I've showed you. We're having an event. It's equivalent to being hit by a meteorite, except it's in slow motion. But it ain't that slow. Local officials, they found plutonium in every sample. It's everywhere. Deteriorating plant threatens mass extinction around the world from these invisible plumes that you can't see or smell or taste or hear or feel or touch or pick up. Nuclear engineer, I agree that Fukushima can be an extinction event. I agree Fukushima can be a extinction event. See, what I do here is I don't have an opinion per se. I show you documentation from just endless sources. Are all of them wrong? And everybody went silent after a couple of years. But does that mean it didn't happen? Does that mean that isotopes that don't go away for 15 million years are magically harmless? These are questions you better start asking yourself, and you better start asking yourself quickly. Human civilization may destroy itself. Michio Kaku, a famous physicist from California. Human civilization may destroy itself. I mean, look at Fukushima, the liquefaction of multiple nuclear reactor cores. Nobel Prize winner, the only way to preserve human life is to completely turn away from nuclear power. And that's like, you got to deal with all these fuel pools hemorrhaging, splitting the atoms, and hemorrhaging radiation 24 hours a day into the environment. You got to deal with it soon. Major U.S. paper, Time to Quit Nuclear Power Altogether. It threatens the very existence of human civilization as we know it. What do you think they're talking about? It's the radioactive fallout that I was talking about. Once a nuclear accident occurs, everything is over. All will be lost. That is the reality of nuclear energy. Leading director in Japan, nuclear power generation is the only invention that may destroy the future of human beings. But you can't destroy the future of humans without destroying all the other species too. Hi, Kevin. Kevin Blanche is in the comments section. I'm glad you showed up, Kevin. We moved and we got a much higher bandwidth at this new place. It's 1.6 gigabytes a second speeds here. Just good news for what we're trying to do, right? We need 1,000 subscribers so I can live stream from my cell phone. Because you took down my other site with 24,000 subscribers. We say goodnight to everybody. I just wanted to put out a show. It's late at night here for me. It's now 12 p.m. But we got to get busy again and get shows back up and running. So we got 69 votes. 69 votes with 27 people on the show, the top number. And 60% of them, the 69, 60% of them says that nuclear is carbon free. And I showed you that it's not, obviously. So we're being spammed by the nuclear industry. 239 Joint. Hi, Joe. Timeless Truth. Kevin Blanche again. Hi, Kevin. HTML, SAM, Kilo, Charlie, Steve White. Hi, everybody. James Olhan. Hi, James. I'm just going to scroll through. Darlene. Good night, everyone. Just going up through the comments, and I'll come back down to recent ones in a minute, and we'll call it a night. Charlie Sands. Kevin Morgan. Good night, everybody. James Lucid. Hi, James. It's good to see everybody. I'm busted up from the move. Oh my God, I'm busted up. You wouldn't believe it. Warren. Hi, Warren. Frack off to the New World Order. I like it. Miles. Jeffrey Brown. Nirad Yeloff. Thanks, Joe. Which is 239 Joint for anybody who's not familiar. Christopher. Sandra Churchill. Hi, Sandra. It's good to see everybody. That means we're back up and running. I feel good. It's been a struggle. Everything else is still everything is in boxes and bags. And I can't find the connector from my Geiger counter. I got no idea what I've done with that. I got to buy a few extra things when we raise a bit of money. It just cost a fortune to move. A fortune, man. But everything is working, so I'm happy. We'll see everybody tomorrow night. I'll be the model, Annie Archie. James Oldhand, thank you, James. Good night, everybody. Fantastic seeing everybody. So the poll, the final numbers on the poll was crazy. Nuclear's not carbon free. We're being spammed, right? That's the nuclear industry spamming us. Pretty despicable thing to do. Pretty cowardly thing to do, isn't it? To have all these ghost accounts just to come in and spam me. I guess that's the new normal. That's the new normal around here. God bless everybody. Hugs for everybody. We'll see everybody tomorrow night. We'll kick ass tomorrow night. God bless everybody. Have a great night, folks. Great day tomorrow. Thanks, Conrad. That's all good, folks. We'll see everybody tomorrow night. Have a great night, folks.